Okay, this is lecture 4. It's called Controlling the Bureaucracy. And we're going to look at a couple different aspects of how the elected parts of the government rein in those who work for the government full time. So first and foremost, we'll look at the presidential influences on the control. Now part of that, of course, comes from the appointment of top-level bureaucrats, and it comes also with the power to fire those top-level bureaucrats. It also comes with the power to propose the reorganization of the executive branch, something that Clinton did in the 1990s, perhaps more effectively than anybody else, that Carter did in the 1970s, and Nixon did in the early 1970s. Then there's also the appointment of the senior executive service personnel. Now what this is about 7,000 senior career officials that can be appointed by the president without Senate consent. They have greater leeway in firing, transferring, promoting, and rewarding these people. And the idea was to make the agencies a lot more accountable and actually act a little bit more like the private sector. Really hasn't changed a whole heck of a lot the way it goes. And sometimes one can say that probably, besides the appointment to or the ability to appoint and the ability to fire, perhaps the most important power that the president has is to propose the agency budgets. Because if you can control the money coming to the agency, you can, in a lot of ways, influence what the agency can do and what it can't do. Now, there are some things that also make it difficult for the presidents to make wholesale changes in the bureaucracy. First and foremost, Senate confirmation is needed for top personnel. You've known that since we've talked about cabinet secretaries and the directors of the FBI and the CIA and the National Security Advisor and the head of the OMB and other positions. And of course, the president, in the fact that he or she can only hire or influence the hiring of about 10% of the bureaucracy, cannot do anything to the other 90%. And we've already seen how difficult it is to fire even incompetent bureaucrats. Now, any reorganization that the president proposes has to go through Congress. And all those agency budgets also go through Congress. And so when we look at the overall things, we can see some failures, we can see some successes. Like I said, the senior executive service has had little impact on the accountability of the bureaucracies. And so consequently, you know, it's pretty much business as usual as we look at how the bureaucracies have functioned in the last 25 to 30 years. Now, Congress comes from a different direction. They, of course, have the appropriations powers for the money that each agency, each department, will receive. They also have the power to conduct oversight. Now, they do this through what's known as the GAO, or the General Accounting Office, which is one of the three big organizations that Congress has. Another one would be the Congressional Budget Office. Not only do they conduct oversight, but they can conduct investigations and they can hold hearings. Now, many of those hearings nowadays are pushed by interest groups who find something that aggrieves their members, and so consequently Congress is pushed to make it known what the problems are in that agency or in that department. Only Congress can ultimately reorganize or sign off on a presidential reorganization of a bureaucracy. So when the Department of Homeland Security was formalized during the Bush years, there was a gathering of a number of different agencies from other departments that were folded into the Department of Homeland Security that could not have happened without the say-so of Congress. Now, as we also know, Congress has the appointment confirmation of all personnel that require it, that the president nominates. And if we could say that there needs to be more of something, we could say that we should have laws that Congress passes that have what we call sunset provisions. Sunset laws give agencies a limited life and require, when their time is up, to justify their existence. Provide evidence as to why they shouldn't be disbanded and their employees dispersed elsewhere if their journey has been completed from the time that the legislation has been initiated to the time that the problem has apparently been resolved. Why would you then continue excuse me, to move on and keep an agency in existence when it can no longer provide a reason for it? But that's what sunset laws do, and we don't have enough of them, in my opinion. Now, there are some limits on congressional power, too. Congress, because it is one of the legs of a iron triangle, and it's probably a leg that is most susceptible to interest group pressure, may not really want to clamp down on a bureaucracy. Presidents like Reagan tried to get rid of the Department of Education and the Department of Energy. And it was these groups that organized to put the pressure on Congress and also put the pressure on the executive branch that ultimately led to, instead of them disappearing, actually some of them growing. So when we look at Congress not really wanting to clamp down on the bureaucracies, we can look at it from this perspective. Members profit from the existence of federal programs within their states and districts. So it's very difficult to end a program when the wealth is spread out enough among congressional members that it would cause economic pain in their district to discontinue the programs, even though nationally they may not be good for the country. At least district-wise or sometimes state-wise, they are good for those states or for those districts. Secondly, we know that it's easier for Congress to pass broadly worded laws and let the bureaucracy fill in the holes, and to the point where the bureaucracies even write some of the rules and regulations that Congress never included in the original law. And of course, we know that when we started our look at Congress, they have not been able to exercise the legislative veto since 1983. Remember, that was INS v. Chadha. And so consequently, Congress has also had its power a little bit reined in dealing with what can sometimes be considered a runaway bureaucracy. So we know that these are large-scale problems that Congress faces when dealing with the bureaucracy. Now, interest groups, like I've intimated previously, are a major catalyst for the battles that the executive branch and the legislative branch has in dealing with the agencies. First and foremost, their biggest power is the ability to lobby and send their highly paid lobbyists in to protect their interest and their clients' interests. The second problem that exists is what we call the revolving door. Those who are in and out of government by moving back and forth between the private sector and the public sector and back and forth and back and forth. Many of these agencies are staffed by people who move back and forth. And the concern is that these people would not really regulate very carefully the very industries that might be their next employer. So you have self-interest. You don't want to come down too hard on an interest group which may hire you to represent them at a later date at a much higher salary. The third group are what we call client groups. Now, they have some agency interest group relations. So when we talk like that, these are relations that are so close that the interest group is said to be a client of the agency. So, for instance, the dairy groups being client groups of the agriculture department, or even in a way the bureaucracy itself that is at the local level of the Department of Agriculture, and those local agents lobbying the headquarters in Washington on behalf of those client groups. It gets very, very layered when it comes to these client agency groups. Now, of course, iron triangles. This is like the third time that we've had iron triangles. These are congressional committees, the relevant agency, and the related interest groups. So you could have the House and Senate Agriculture Committee, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and then related interest groups like the Grange or the United States Beef Producers Association or the Dairy Farmers Association. Then you've got something called the issue networks, or an alternative name would be the policy networks, and these are informal groups of people who work in the private and public sectors who come together because of a common interest. So you can see that Washington in some ways can be a big morass when it comes to how they have to deal with the public and all the pressures that exist within that structure. Now, the media also influences the behavior of bureaucracies. First and foremost, they're the watchdog. They scrutinize agency behavior. And when an agency seems to be doing something underhanded, they're there. They shove cameras into people's faces. They do investigative reporting, or they at least should be doing that. And they also expose the information that's given to them by by whistleblowers. So if we go back to scrutiny, I'll give you an example. The investigations that Congress made, as well as the press and others, as to why the FBI and the CIA didn't talk to each other, and did they heed the warning signs that were there prior to the attack on 9/11 by terrorists? And so consequently, in the 1980s, there was a Whistleblower Act that was put into place, and this gave any whistleblower who tried to publicize what they felt was wrongdoing would be protected by law, and also be protected from retaliation from within whatever agency they worked in. So, for instance, the FBI memo concerning ineptitude in pursuing terrorist threats before 9/11, those people, especially the woman who headed the Minneapolis office, was protected from retaliation by her superiors in FBI headquarters in Washington from being terminated. And in the years before the law was in place, she could very well have been terminated, and we never would have been able to find out exactly what the problems were. But she was able to disseminate her concerns far and wide, and she was protected, as she very well should have been. Now, the courts also influence or control bureaucratic behavior by the use of injunctions and what we call the writs of mandamus. Injunctions keep an entity, an agency, from doing something. Writs of mandamus tell them to do something. We see writs of mandamus for the first time in the first big case. This is something I can't remember it. Not McCullough v. Maryland, but the first case in which Marshall establishes judicial review. Um, the plaintiff wanted James Madison to issue a writ of mandamus requiring the president to um, fill the judgeship, and Marbury, in the case Marbury v. Madison, um, lost his case because the courts refused to order the president to issue a writ of mandamus filling that position with Marbury. Now, another thing that has occurred has been an effort to privatize certain parts of government. An example of that would be private concessions within national parks as a means of making the bureaucracy more efficient. They really, really have, in a lot of ways, dug their feet in, and it's very difficult to privatize some parts of the government because people don't look at that as being an advantage. They think that that is a disadvantage, and it's according to probably how your political philosophy is as to how you feel about privatizing certain things that government does. And finally, we're going to talk about the National Performance Review. Now, this was a job given to Vice President Gore by President Clinton in 1993. And the NPR stands for National Performance Review. It doesn't stand for National Public Radio. And Gore was given the job of reinventing government, which is probably where a little bit of that Gore invented the internet stuff comes in. Gore did not invent the internet. But the purpose of the NPR was to bring the bureaucracy into the modern age, from the age of the quill pen to the age of WordPerfect. Now, if you don't know what WordPerfect is, in the 1980s and early 1990s, it was a huge competitor to Microsoft Office. Now you don't hear anything about WordPerfect, nor do you hear anything about Lotus, which was another word processing program from back then. The goal was to make the bureaucracies more accountable and more effective. And so what Gore set out to do was to study each of the bureaucratic departments, begin to eliminate certain subsidies that kept many of these departments flush with money when they no longer needed the money to run those programs, and then of course reduce programs that were no longer needed, and ultimately even reduce the number of federal employees. And Clinton did reduce the number of federal employees by about 250,000. Now, that didn't mean that all of them lost their jobs. They went to other places. Many of them were put under state and local jurisdiction, but many jobs did disappear. And he was also looking to reduce the amount of red tape. Sometimes we are all frustrated by what we think are illogical things that bureaucrats have to do. They can't skip from part B to part H. They have to literally go through C, D, E, and F and G before they can get to H. We think it's wasteful and time-consuming and just dumb, but that's the way bureaucracies work. Their paperwork and the fealty of that paperwork is very important to them. Now, one of the other things that Clinton did, and I think it's gone through 4 or 5 iterations since then, was try to bring, because the Cold War had ended and I say that ended with quotation marks around it in 1991, the question came before Americans, do we need all of those military bases? The problem is, of course, if you close a military base, then you're affecting the economic performance and the economic circumstances of each of those districts that a military base is in, and ultimately you could be affecting the economic performance of a state. So everybody was ready to fight tooth and nail. So what Clinton and Congress did was come together with a military base closing commission that would come up with a number of bases to close. And Congress had to either vote up or down. They couldn't tear it apart. They had to consider it as one bill. It couldn't be amended. It couldn't be, bases couldn't be dropped. They had to either say yes or no. They've always said yes, and we have eliminated quite a few of those bases. Now, ultimately, the NPR under Gore came up with about 400 recommendations, eliminating certain subsidies, programs, and things like that. 16,000 pages of regulations were eliminated. And Clinton claimed that he had saved taxpayers about $100 billion in savings. But by 2001, all of those, many of those jobs and certainly all that money that had been saved was being spent as the Clinton administration morphed into the Bush administration. So this ends lecture number 4, the controlling the bureaucracy, and we're going to look at evaluating the bureaucracy in lecture 5.